Okay, time for another video. This one is about the composer Henry Purcell and his opera Dido and Aeneas. So Henry Purcell is an English composer, generally considered to be the greatest of all English composers. He had a very spectacular early career. He got his early training as a choir boy in the Chapel Royal, and that is the private chapel for the English royal family. And from there, he got a job at age 18. He was appointed composer to the King's String Orchestra. And from there, he was appointed organist at Westminster Abbey. Very illustrious and prestigious job. And then finally appointed organist at the Chapel Royal, where he had started out as a choir boy. Unfortunately, Purcell didn't live very long. He was born in 1659 and died 1695. Only lived 36 years, just about the same amount of time that Mozart, who lived 100 years later, just about the same tragically brief lifespan. Purcell composed all kinds of music during his short life, but perhaps what he is best known for is his only opera, which is considered the greatest opera in the English language, and this is Dido and Aeneas. In order to explain about Dido and Aeneas, unfortunately, we have to make some references, first of all, to the Roman poet Virgil, who is the author of the Aeneid, which is the epic poem upon which Dido and Aeneas is based. Dido and Aeneas is about actually just one episode from Virgil's epic poem, the Aeneid. The Aeneid, in turn, which was written around, I believe around 20 BC, during the reign of Augustus, the first Roman emperor. The Aeneid is heavily based upon Greek myth and upon, ultimately, the Iliad of Homer. If you're familiar with the Trojan Wars, if you've read at all any of the Iliad or the Odyssey by Homer, now that was written around 800 BC, but in turn that was based on Greek myth that goes back even a long time before that. The events described in the Iliad are thought to have taken place around 1200 BC, which, just for reference sake, is about the same time as Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt. Okay, so now, is all this going to be on the test? Probably not, but I want you to actually understand this stuff, not just memorize a few factoids that are going to be on the test. So one thing that ties in, remember that early opera was based upon, generally speaking, Greek or Roman myth and history. This is because, as I mentioned in a previous lecture, the whole idea behind the invention of opera, the idea of the people who invented it. Remember the Camerata in Florence, this group of humanist intellectuals, lovers of Greek and Roman culture. Their idea was to reinvent a sort of a modernized version of Greek tragedy, which they consider to be the greatest art form of all time. So it kind of stands to reason that the early operas, such as Orfeo, that I talked about last time, and Eurydice, the very earliest surviving opera, both based on the same Greek myth. So now we have Henry Purcell composing an opera that is based on a story taken from Virgil's Aeneid. Okay. First of all, the librettist, the guy who wrote the actual words for this opera, was Nahum Tate. Nahum Tate was a friend of Purcell's who happened to be a teacher at a girls' boarding school. So this opera was actually performed for these girls, and the very first performance was given by these teen or tween age girls at this boarding school. It's a relatively short opera. I think it's only a little over an hour long, and that's probably, taking into consideration the fact that it was written for this boarding school. Nahum Tate adapted, took his words, his libretto, from the Aeneid by Virgil. So again, Virgil was a poet active in Rome around the time of Augustus. In fact, he was Augustus's kind of court poet. And the Aeneid tells the story of a Trojan prince named Aeneas. That is, he is a survivor of the destruction of Troy, which is described in the familiar Greek myth, described in Homer's Iliad. Maybe some of this is coming back from some of your high school history classes. Of course, the Trojan War was this war between the Greeks and the Trojans, supposedly because this Trojan prince Paris kidnapped or ran away with the beautiful Greek princess Helen. And the Greeks, seeking their revenge, of course, launched 1,000 ships and made war on Troy. Ultimately, the Greeks won because of the famous Trojan horse. And once they got into the city, thanks to the Trojan horse, they, of course, laid waste to the city, destroyed the city of Troy. According to Virgil, there were a few survivors of the destruction of Troy, and they were led by Aeneas, who was a Trojan prince. And Aeneas was sort of given this task by the gods to lead the survivors of Troy in their journey through the Mediterranean to find a place to build a new city. And wouldn't you know it, that city turns out to be Rome. And the Romans actually believed that they were descended from Aeneas and from those refugees from the destruction of Troy. It's not really true, but it made for a nice myth, and it made for a nice way to connect Roman history and culture to Greek history and culture. So, part of this story, the Aeneid, in this poem, one of the episodes that forms the basis for this opera has to do with Aeneas and his ships being blown off course in a storm. So remember, they're sailing through the Mediterranean from Troy, which is at this narrow straits called the Dardanelles that leads from the Mediterranean up into the Black Sea. Very strategic, important sea passage, even to this day. So Aeneas is leading these survivors in a fleet of ships, and they're sailing through the Mediterranean, and they get blown off course and seek refuge in the North African port city of Carthage. Now, Carthage hopefully should ring a bell to you. Again, if you know any of your ancient history, the Romans and the Carthaginians fought a series of brutal wars known as the Punic Wars. There were 3 separate wars, and this is during the 3rd century or so BC. Now, those wars have not yet happened in the context of the Aeneid. That's still several hundred years in the future. But what Virgil is doing by telling of this episode is kind of planting the seed, giving us an explanation for why there was such bad blood between the Carthaginians and the Romans. Okay, so here's what happens. Aeneid and his ships are blown off course. They wind up near the city of Carthage, which was located basically where the present-day city of Tunis is. If you look up on a map and you look at the northern coast of Africa, right where there's this sort of bump in the north coast of Africa, there's the city of Tunis, and it's just right across the Mediterranean, a short distance away from Sicily and from the boot of Italy. So Aeneas and his ships pull into port, and they are greeted by the Carthaginians, led by their queen, Dido. And the Carthaginians are very hospitable towards these poor shipwrecked Trojans, and Dido invites Aeneas to come to a banquet that evening. So Aeneas attends this banquet, and the other guests at the banquet ask him, so tell us about, where are you from? What has happened to you? And Aeneas begins to tell his story, and he tells of the destruction of Troy, and he tells of his journeys. And as he's talking and telling his story, Dido falls in love with him. So Dido and Aeneas fall in love with each other. The problem, though, is this can never be a happily ever after kind of love story, because remember, Aeneas cannot stay there in Carthage with Dido. He has a mission given to him by the gods, and you dare not defy the gods. His mission is to lead his people and to find a place to build a new city, which will ultimately be the city of Rome. So at a certain point, Aeneas has to break the news to Dido. He says, look, I've been given a mission by the gods. I'd love to stay here with you, but unfortunately that is not my destiny. and they get into a big fight. Now, Dido has her own problems. She has people plotting her downfall there within Carthage. So there are some kind of subplots involved. But the main point is that Aeneas has to leave her. And they get into a big fight toward the end of the opera. And Dido says, oh, you and your mission from the gods. Fine, go ahead, leave me. You know, I thought you loved me. You told me you loved me, and now you're going to leave me because of this mission from the gods. And Aeneas says, look, okay, if it'll make you happy, I will stay here with you. I'll defy the gods for you to show you how much I love you. And she says, no, 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 you go ahead. You got your mission. Go. So they get in this big fight. And ultimately, Aeneas storms off, and he leads his people back to the ships. They get in the ships, and they start pulling away. In the original poem by Virgil, Aeneas has left his sword behind. Because he stormed off in a huff, he's left his sword in Dido's bedroom. And Dido picks up the sword and stabs herself with it. In the opera, maybe because that was considered too violent or something, too gruesome for this performance by these young girls in this boarding school, that part is left off, and Dido simply kind of dies of heartbreak at the end of the opera. If you look at the video clip, remember in the liked videos on my YouTube channel, you'll find all your required listening. And I've linked to a particularly, I think, excellent performance of Dido's Lament. And in that version of it, they show Dido taking some poison just before she starts to sing. All right? So that's one way that a director of the opera might give a reason as to exactly why Dido was dying, other than just kind of dying of melancholy or heartbreak. Anyway, as Dido begins to die, she starts to sing, of course, this being opera. And the song that she sings, known as Dido's Lament, is in two parts. The first part is a recitative, and this is this speech-like style of singing that I've talked about. And the second part is an aria. In the recitative, she is basically calling out to her friend, her lady-in-waiting, Belinda, and asking Belinda to just sort of comfort her because she's about to die. She says, give me your hand, Belinda. Death invades me. Death is now a welcome guest. She actually wants to die because Aeneas has left her. And then she starts to sing this aria. And in this aria, she is singing to Aeneas. Of course, Aeneas is not there to hear her. He's already starting to sail away, but she's addressing him. And she says to him, when I am laid in earth, when I'm dead, when I'm in the ground, may my wrongs create no trouble in thy breast. In other words, however I have wronged you, if I've hurt your feelings, if I've wronged you somehow, don't remember me that way. Try not to think of me and the fact that I died because you broke my heart and I'm in the ground. No, carry on with your life and your mission, right? Remember me, but forget my fate, she sings. And of course, as she's singing, she's dying. Now, what's interesting about this aria is that it features a basso ostinato. And now remember, from a previous lecture and also from your book, they talk about what a basso ostinato is. Basso ostinato literally means a stubborn bass, an obstinate bass. Ostinato is simply the Italian word for obstinate, which means stubborn. A basso ostinato is simply a melodic pattern in the bass line that repeats itself over and over and over again, obstinately or stubbornly. And this is a kind of thing we find all over the place in all different kinds of music, especially actually in pop music. Like every Led Zeppelin song practically. Maybe I'm dating myself there, I think of in terms of Led Zeppelin, but every Led Zeppelin song has an ostinato. In this case, the ostinato in Dido's Lament has a sort of a symbolic purpose as well, because the pattern that repeats itself over and over again is a descending chromatic bass line. It starts here on G and goes down mostly by half steps. And what this is meant to symbolize is Dido's fate, for she is destined to die And when she's singing, she's saying, when I am laid in the earth. So we think of both her sinking into death and her being physically laid into the earth, into the ground, after she dies. Right? And this pattern just repeats over and over and over again throughout the aria. Right? This is an example of something I talked about earlier when I was talking about the elements of Baroque music. One of the things I mentioned, and you can look it up in the book, is this idea called the Doctrine of Affections. Remember, the word affections really means moods or emotions. That's the word that they used back then, the way that we today use the word mood or emotion. The Doctrine of Affections was the idea that certain musical figures, purely musical things like certain rhythms or pitch patterns or chords, could have a definite meaning, could be sort of used as a code in a sense. The example I gave actually in a previous lecture is something we're all very familiar with. If you are in a horror movie and you hear this sound, right, that dissonant kind of stabbing sound, it makes us think of a knife stabbing. If you've ever seen the famous Hitchcock movie Psycho, this is the kind of thing we find in all kinds of movies, actually. The way that our emotions can be manipulated by the film score composer because we are all tuned into certain devices, and they've been used enough times over the years by enough different composers that they take on almost a concrete, definite meaning to us. So this is what composers during the Baroque era were kind of tuned into. Remember, their whole approach was that the primary goal of an artwork, whether it's music, the visual arts, whatever it is, should be to get an emotional response, should be to affect the emotions. That's the primary goal. And what better way to do that than to sort of encode certain emotions or certain states of being into specific musical patterns. So that's what the Doctrine of Affections is all about. In Purcell's day, anyone who heard this kind of thing, this chromatic descending bass line, knew instantly, oh, somebody's going to die, or somebody already is dying. Okay, this represents death, this kind of thing, very, very clearly. Okay, now, Dido sings over top of that this melody. That is her fate, and she can't escape it. Okay, so listen to and watch, because it's a video clip, really to experience opera the way it was meant to be experienced. We should not just listen to it, but watch it. So find the video clip and listen and watch to Purcell's masterpiece, probably his best-known song, Didos Lament from Dido and Aeneas. And next time we'll start to talk about instrumental music. See ya.